Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
One of the most frustrating aspects of evangelicalism is the claim of having, in fact, the insistence that you must have a personal relationship with God and or with Jesus. Many Christians like to trumpet the phrase, we don't have a religion, we have a relationship. I know I made that claim. Did you ever, Scott?
Oh, for sure.
You want to tell us about that or not?
Just leave it at that? Well, I mean, it's just endemic. I mean, it's just to the movement. I mean, in fact, I think for most evangelicals, including myself, that if you say, well, what's the difference between a capital C Christian, what we would call a Christian, and a nominal Christian or a non-Christian, but particularly a nominal Christian. So they go to church, maybe they're part of one of the big denominations, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Catholic, whatever. But many evangelicals say, yeah, but they're not a Christian. And you say, well, what do you mean by that? They subscribe to these orthodox beliefs. Well, yeah, but to be a Christian is to have a personal relationship with Jesus. That's, yeah.
Yeah. And I've said many times before in many previous episodes how I just can't understand that claim anymore. And the reason is because of the many other relationships that I have and what all those other relationships share in common. They all involve interaction between me and that other being, actual real exchanges between us, and not just verbal, but physical exchanges, shared experiences. They're all very different in degree. Some of those relationships are distant and some are incredibly intimate. The one example I often use of a very distant and impersonal relationship that I do have is the one that I have, the relationship I have with the Prime Minister of my country. He and I have never met, and we've never taken the opportunity to talk, but I know who he is, where he is, and what he does, and he knows that there are people under his leadership, people like me. I send taxes to his government, I vote for or against him, and he sets up laws and policies that affect my daily life. And there are real opportunities in which I could be in his physical presence, conceivably, if he was coming to Hamilton one day, for example, and even possibly to have a face-to-face meeting with him if I had some kind of an issue that I was wanting to bring to his attention. Scott, my wife and I, we have a picture of us standing with Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton. I could have put my arm around him if it wasn't for the fact that I would have been tackled by the security team.
Yeah. Is that when he came to Toronto for the book signing?
He came to Hamilton, actually. He was a special speaker for our hospital, for our foundation, the St. Joseph's Healthcare. Yes.
Yeah, that's
neat. It was
a
fundraiser.
Yeah.
So now that's Bill Clinton, but the Prime Minister of my country, we do have a relationship, but it's a very, very distant and impersonal one. And then I've got other relationships that are increasingly personal and even intimate. Sure. My neighbors, the clerk at the bank, my mechanic coworkers, my kids, my wife. I could go on, but I don't think I need to. All of these I've had conversations with. They've talked with me. They've shook my hand or they've hugged me. They've done tangible things for me and with me. But in the evangelical part of my life, people also spoke about a relationship, a very personal relationship. In fact, the most personal relationship one could have, namely the one that we would have with God or with Jesus. And I keep separating those two because really those two relationships would have to look very different, wouldn't they, Scott?
Yeah.
Now, there are extremes of views here. Yes, there are evangelicals who will talk about distinctly hearing the voice of God and those who will talk about being in daily conversation with Jesus, even moment by moment. I'm not going to make jokes about that, but I will say that as much as I tried, I could never sincerely claim to have been in conversation with the divine. How about you, Scott?
No, I'm kind of in the same boat. And at certain times in my life, much to my frustration, because
yes.
Felt kind of like a second-class Christian, and then told if I did certain things that would happen, and it didn't, and so on. Yeah.
I made many attempts. I initiated many conversations and many appeals, and some were more emotional than others, but I never heard from either God or Jesus. And we did an episode on that almost 3 years ago. That episode is as fresh and meaningful now as it was when we first released it. So I'll ask the listeners to listen to that one too. It's number 42 in the archives. I'll have a link in the show notes for it. So we have talked about that whole idea of a personal relationship, but what we didn't do in that interview is talk to an expert who has actually studied the phenomenon. Today, we will talk to just such a scholar. Dr. Tanya M. Lerman did her undergrad work at Harvard's Radcliffe College, studying folklore and mythology, then did graduate work in social anthropology at Cambridge University, studying witches and druids in modern-day England, as well as a modern community of Zoroastrians in India. More recently, she turned her focus to the modern-day evangelical community in America and their claims of personal relationship and personal interactions with the divine. And then most recently, she carried out a much larger study of 5 different cultural groups in 5 different countries, also looking into their religious experiences. Out of all that work came a couple absolutely great books that I'd highly recommend to our listeners. The first one, When God Talks Back, Understanding the American Evangelical Relationship with God. And then more recently, How God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others. Dr. Lerman is currently a psychological anthropologist based at Stanford University. So, Dr. Lerman, welcome to our podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Tanya, I think it's important to put on the table that you have quite a bit of firsthand experience with religion. You don't necessarily claim any particular faith of your own at this time, but you did grow up within and around various religious influences. And that's important because some of that led to you pursuing the work that you do, as I understand it. So maybe just tell us a bit about that part of your earlier life.
It's an important point. My mom was the daughter of a Baptist pastor, Northern, but a Baptist nonetheless. And her sisters became what we would now call fundamentalist or evangelical Christians. My father grew up as the son of a Christian scientist, and he went to medical school, which is not what you associate with Christian Science, which is a faith in which you're not supposed to go to doctors. We lived when I was young, in a town in New Jersey with an Orthodox Jewish shul. And so many of the people in my neighborhood were very conservative Jews. And I was, in fact, I sort of was what's called a Shabbos Goy for the family with a house behind ours. In Orthodox Judaism, there's an expectation that you do not work on the Sabbath between Friday sundown and Saturday sundown. And that has come to mean not touching electricity. And so a Shabbos Goy is somebody who comes over to the house, turns on and off the stove or on and off the lights,
Wow.
has a lovely dinner, and then goes home. And I was struck. So I knew all of these, good, kind people in my childhood who had very different views about what God was, whether there was a God, and what the rules were about how to interact with God. And that always stayed with me. That always puzzled me.
And so you grew up with maternal aunts and cousins who would claim to have heard from God, and other relatives who in some way would interact with the deity, and in that sense hear voices. But your father went on to become a psychologist and dealt with people who heard voices, and this was a little bit of a... Tell us,
Yes.
You followed in his footsteps.
Yes, he is an atheist and a psychiatrist, an MD. And he worked often with very ill people who did hear voices.
Right.
And so I wasn't really thinking about the puzzle of spiritual experience and madness when I was young, but it was sort of, it was pretty clear that there were some people who had a bunch of ideas about things that couldn't be seen, who were acceptable. That was understood to be a respected way of being in the world. And there were other people who had ideas about invisible beings who ended up in the hospital. And so that was, that has remained with me as a kind of interesting puzzle.
Yeah, that is really fascinating to me, I guess, in particular, maybe. But I guess puzzling that out, like that line of demarcation between what's illness and what is, a fundamentally sane, healthy person, but also who claims to have certain... Has that been a real challenge for you over the years, puzzling that out?
Absolutely. So alongside of the work that you described in religion, I've also done quite a bit of work on psychiatric topics. So I wrote a book about the training of young psychiatrists. And I also spent many years on the streets of Chicago talking to people who did hear voices. And alongside this 5-country study where we were talking to people about spiritual experience, I've attempted to also do a study along along the side of that project with people in those countries who were unambiguously ill, people in psychiatric settings who heard voices. And so I now have something to say about the difference between the ill and the not ill, and
Mm.
the ambiguity in the middle of trying to how to make sense of that, and how culture shapes these experiences.
Did you have opportunity to talk to your father about that?
Yes. I mean, I
It,
also spent quite a bit of time with people, so I benefited from his clinical insights as I navigated that world.
It's interesting that one of the most popular books on the atheist side of the equation in recent years, of course, is the God delusion. And
Mhm.
that's kind of an interesting term, right? It's obviously quite loaded. And
Right.
so, in your dad's case, how did he view religion? Was it kind of a delusion to him, or did he see the clearly the difference between a delusion and
Oh, I think he would distinguish between the metaphorical use of delusion and the
right,
psychiatric use of delusion.
right.
But he really did not have, he wasn't really sort of what you might call spiritually musical, whereas my mother was.
Oh,
My mother always, went to church till the end of her life.
hmm,
But she loved those books by, Sam Harris and Dan Dennett and the sort of these books that talk about power, the insights of atheism. And so she had a kind of betwixt and between involvement with faith.
wow.
so, Tanya, we do want to hear about your work looking at evangelical Christians and how they relate to God. But before we get into that story, I think we need to first hear about your studies that led up to that work and informed it later on. So, especially the studies you've done with a variety of cultural groups, all of whom claim some kind of a special access to a realm or a dimension and experience that's beyond the reach for most other people, at least without doing a lot of hard work and practice. And so, your work, again, as I mentioned earlier, your work with a community in England who practice magic, and your work more recently with the 5 different religious communities in different countries. So, tell us about what you found in those studies, how you did those studies, and what you found.
So you could say that the most consequential for me was my first study with middle class folks in London who practice what they call magic and witchcraft. So this is witchcraft in the positive sense. These are people who thought of them, the witches thought of themselves as kind of following an ancient earth goddess. And, we would call these folks pagans today. But they had this idea that all of, there are all sorts of different groups in London at this time. There were Kabbalists and there were initiates of the Western mysteries, and there were Druids, there were all kinds of people. And all of them shared this idea that there was power in the world, there was force, and that you could use your mind, pull in that force and direct it in certain ways. And they mostly also thought that there were beings sort of floating in and around and connected with the force who were called variously gods or spirits or contacts, or, depending on your group, sometimes the dead. So mediums were sort of associated with this world. And so I, as a graduate student, and even as an undergrad, had been quite taken by the question of why people took magic seriously. And there was a famous book by a famous anthropologist about East Africa by a guy called Evans Pritchard, Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azande. And he had an account of how easy it is to believe in magic, but how these ideas about magic were different from ideas about science. And I thought that it would be kind of interesting to talk to people who had ideas about magic, which in many ways were similar to, in some crude sense, similar to the Azandi ideas, but they were all well trained in science. And so that's how I found myself in London. And what I expected, so first I should tell you, located these groups. They're pretty secretive. I got myself initiated. I spent like something like 2 years in these groups learning how to read tarot cards and do rituals and write rituals and sort of be part of the group and learn all about the gods and goddesses and spirits in these different worlds. And I thought in the beginning of the project that I would be studying sort of what you might call narratives or heuristics or cognitive ideas that would make sense of how somebody could come from here, not thinking about much about magic, to over here, where magic was sort of secondhand for them. And I found that. But I also found that people said that if I wanted to understand magic, I had to learn to do magic, and that some people were better at this than others, and the people who did this would change. And so I did this enthusiastically. I took like 2 home study courses. I went to an occult exercise group. I was in this group and that group. And I was in a group where we tried to understand our dreams. And, so I did all this stuff. The stuff all had a certain common structure. It involved trying to pay sharp attention to inner mental imagery. And what I saw, what I experienced, and what people talked about was that you changed when that happened. Your psychological experience or your mental experience changed in going through the training. Your inner world became more vivid, and I felt my mental images were becoming sharper. Everything seemed to be connected, and there were no more coincidences. Everything was connected in a meaningful web, and people felt the magical power. And they had cool, weird experiences. So I remember, this being taken aback by going to one of these events and feeling magical power course through me. I went on a run once, and I was reenacting a sort of Kabbalistic ritual that I had gone to earlier in the week, which had been led. There were like 50 people, maybe 40 people at the meeting. And the meeting was led by this very important guy in this world called an adept. So a super important magician. And he had us do rituals, and the rituals involved shutting our eyes and seeing a story in our mind's eye. And the story was full of sensory detail. I think this was involved with Francis Drake and Queen Elizabeth, and we were supposed to imagine wearing Elizabeth's shoes and how tight they were on our feet, and there was the taste of the salt spray on the deck, and the way the wind rushed against our face, and lots of sensory stuff, but in this dark room with our eyes shut. Anyway, so I that took a weekend. I came back, I went for a run, and I sort of reenacted some of this in my mind. And as I did that, I felt this force come through me. I really sort of felt it. And it captured my attention.
Sure.
The other thing that was kind of striking about that story is that I had bought, everyone would say, you can't wear a watch when you're doing one of these rituals because the watch will break. And I, graduate student, I just bought a Japanese-made watch for £5. Not a watch you'd have a lot of faith in. I was wearing the watch. It was raining when I went for the run. And when I came back from the run, watch never worked again. And I remember having this feeling, wow, maybe this stuff works. And also thinking, wow, that's the kind of experience that people have that makes them think that this stuff works. So I had both of those ideas. But what I saw, so just to finish quickly, what I saw was that people who did the practice really did change. And that began to fascinate me.
Tanya, you also tell a story of I think you were waking up and you saw druids.
I did. So this was a little farther into the practice. And I should preface it by saying that something like 40% of all people have what are called hypnopompic or hypnagogic hallucinations. These are experiences on the edge of sleep that are probably, in an approximate way, caused by still sort of dreaming while you're sort of awake. So
Mm.
there's some kind of REM cycle, whatever, that's approximately involved. But I had been reading this book written by somebody from this world called The Mists of Avalon on the Arthurian romance.
Mm.
And there was Arthur, and there were druids, and there was
Mm.
Nimue, and there was like Morgaine, and Morgaine was a witch. And I was really trying to read this book without, any scholarly apparatus. I wasn't thinking, oh, how is she writing how is Marion Zimmer Bradley writing the protagonist here? I was like trying to live in the book. And while I was reading this book, I woke up early in the morning and I saw these 6 druids standing by the window. And I was really struck by the fact that I had a feeling of perception.
Mm.
So, it seemed to me, and this was an insight, that I don't really think about what's happening when I'm having a perceptual experience. But I saw these druids, and I sort of, on one level, I knew there were no druids standing by the window, but I felt that they were real. I felt that I saw them.
Mm.
And I shot out of bed and they disappeared. And I wrote them down in my dream diary because, of course, I was keeping a dream diary at the time, and I went back to sleep. And then later in the day, I woke up, I went about my day, and I suddenly thought, I thought I had an experience. And I went and I had, I'd written this, underlined capital letters, this felt real. And so that again really captured my attention.
Mm.
So it's, what I thought I saw, it wasn't just me. I mean, lots of people would have little stories like that.
Hmm.
Uh, and some of them were sort of low, I'll call them perceptually low level. So somebody would say, I remember this. This is one of my first, this is the back at that first event I went to with this Merlin-like adept. I was sitting down to lunch, and the woman behind me said, oh, the goddess has asked me to do a ritual on the Isle of Wight, but I don't have the money to do that, so I'm not going to do it right now. It's like, that's such an interesting sentence.
Yeah.
And so, and mostly when people were had sentences like that, mostly they were describing what I would now call in the mind experiences.
Right.
They're having a interior experience that they somehow judge as not their own. But people would also have these these outer sensory experiences, which they knew were not veridical in some boring material sense. So somebody talked about looking into the mirror and she saw the goddess. She knew she wasn't the goddess, but she sort of felt that she had this visual experience. Somebody talked to me about seeing a head on a table when she walked into the room. I thought that was a little wobbly, but in any event, it was,
Yeah.
but people would talk about these things. And sometimes, somebody was trying to do lucid dreaming, which
Yeah.
is a technique in which you can be present in your dreams. And I think he found this book, and he had a dream, but as he woke up, he heard a voice say, sacrifice to Zeus,
Mm.
out loud. And so he goes off and he takes a stake with him to some park. There's a hill. He lights a fire. He sacrifices the stake. And then he starts getting involved with magic. I mean, so people had these weird experiences. And I thought that was so cool because there was something about culture, ideas, or practices that were sort of getting into under your skin, into your awareness, that were really changing you pretty deeply.
Mm-hmm.
So great.
So either of you could help me here. There's a branch of Christian meditation that does exactly what you were just saying, Tanya. You immerse yourself, you meditate on a story or an experience, and you try to imagine the sensory. I think you made reference to you feel the brush of the wind across
Yeah.
the face.
Ignatius
Yeah.
Ignatius
Yeah.
meditation,
Yeah.
very
And
similar.
and so this practice in the broad brush, the spiritual practice of focusing on inner sensory imagery is extremely common.
Mm.
Okay.
Ignatian spiritual exercises or Ignatian spirituality sort of does it on steroids. So, Ignatian spirituality, as Ignatius sort of designed it at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th, you would sort of retreat for a month, and there were 4 stories you were involved with. I think it was the story of Jesus's birth, and the story of the Passion, the story of Transfiguration, I think. Yeah, and then there are actually many stories, but there are many biblical stories. And Ignatius would lay out the story for you. And so there were the big periods of stories, and then there were particular stories. So, like, there's the story of the flight to Egypt. And so Ignatius says, okay, there's Mary, she's on the donkey, there's Joseph. Now ask, is the road wide? Is it narrow? Is it sunny? Is it dark? And sort of there's an invitation to think, well, how, during the Annunciation, is Gabriel tall and frightening or small and cuddly? Is Mary 16? Is she 13? Is she 32? Is she happy? Is she sad? And Ignatius was pretty comfortable in these exercises, and he's not worried about heresy. He's worried whether you are imaginatively caught up. Explicitly has you use all your senses, and he also has you talk to God before the exercise, and I think at the end sometimes. So it's pretty structured. There's something pretty basic about these practices, and also they can be elaborated and developed in different ways.
It's interesting. I have a technology background, amongst some other things. There's a lot of interest these days. Of course, AI, that's a separate thing, but there's a lot of interest these days in virtual reality. And of course, Apple released their big 5,000, well, Canadian, American, I guess, $3,500 goggles. And you hear the word immersive used a lot. And it almost seems to me that this is a pre-technological immersiveness. In other words, you're creating your own virtual reality inside your head. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, I was so taken with that I actually prodded a friend of mine who studies VR professionally to compare Ignatian spiritual practices with VR immersion. And by the time we boiled it down to an experiment, I sort of thought that the Ignatian spirituality might trump the virtual exposure. But by the time he boiled it down to the experiment, there wasn't nearly enough time for the imaginative practice to catch up. But yes, I think that's entirely correct. I mean, you are really trying to have this immersive experience. And I think there's a psychological story, which is that, the cultural story is that here is a group of people who invite you to do this. The psychological story is that you do the immersion, your inner world becomes much more vivid. And what I think happens psychologically is that for reasons we don't really understand, I can kind of guess at some mechanisms, but that practice of increasing vivid attention leads to some experiences coming to feel more perceptual. And so there's, somehow, when we know people who do these practices, they're more likely to report voices and visions and a sense of presence and all sorts of cool, weird experiences.
Mm.
So that's fascinating. But you also did an extensive study looking at practitioners of 5 different faiths, 5 different countries, all claiming some kind of access to a further realm. I'm not using the right language, but tell us about that study.
So by that point, I was persuaded that there was a cultural dimension to this story. I knew that there was here's a practice dimension. I knew a little bit about how people were practicing. They're doing this intensive, immersive practice. But then I have this implicit, I presume that whatever is true ontologically, when people have vivid experiences, what's really happening is that they have something mental like that they are experiencing as more than mental. It feels as if it's inside them, but not from them, or it's not from them, and it's even outside of them. They can hear it with their ears. So I thought that the next anthropological step was to say, okay, if people think differently about thinking, does that change the experience? And so we asked, is there a relationship with the way people seem to think about thinking with the way in which they experience gods and spirits? And so we did, I recruited a bunch of highly capable, language competent people, and we worked in parts of the world which we thought where people had different ways of, there were different, I'll call them invitations, different invitations to think about thinking. So, you've got this cultural idea, a lot of cultural ideas floating around in our worlds. Sometimes we pay attention, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we believe them, sometimes we don't. We went to Ghana, we went to Thailand, we went to Vanuatu, and to China, to Shanghai. And in each of those places, we had a kind of urban location and a rural location. And we were interested in charismatic Christians, so new evangelicals who want an intimate relationship with God in all 5 places, and local religions in all 5 places. And we did 3 kinds of methods. We had long face-to-face follow-up, hang out and talk interviews with people of faith, charismatic Christians and the local faith. We trained research assistants and we made them go stand online at the equivalent of the DMV. And they asked a set of questions, 15, 20-minute interviews. And then we took questionnaires and we got undergraduates to fill them out. So all of this work, there's lots of noise. People kind of, they don't fill out the surveys in a way that they're not paying attention, or, somebody loses the recording, or, somebody's faxing, and that, we really tried to pay attention to the details. And what we found was that there was a general thing to say that was true in all these sites. So we'd asked a set of questions to all the different kinds of people, some of them religious, some of them not. And the questions were all about how a god or a spirit might communicate. And they're questions like, ever hear God speak in a way you could hear with your ears? You ever have a thought from God? Not a voice, but a thought that he placed in your mind. Ever feel that God placed a mental image in your mind? What about seeing a vision? What about, with your eyes? That wasn't really there, but you felt like you saw it with your eyes. You ever feel the presence of God as if he's standing right next to you? You knew where he was standing in the room. Ever felt a demon in the room, or a sense of evil, a presence of evil? We asked about sleep paralysis and out-of-body experiences and possession experiences. And we had, we sort of longer and shorter list. We also asked people, having spent a bunch of time there and done a lot of talking, we asked people about what I'll call porosity. So let me just explain that. Humans, by virtue of being conscious, always think, they recognize that being aware is different from the world. Like, they always distinguish between what you could call mind and what you could call body. But they do it in different ways. So some people will, think that anger is a little bit more bodily, and maybe happiness is a little bit more mental. I mean, they draw the line in different ways, and they talk about it in different ways, and they have different words, and they have different commitments. But one of the things that is always there is that there's a distinction between mindy stuff and worldly stuff. And you either imagine that there's a concrete wall between those two, or there's kind of a little bit more like a net, like it's permeable. And it comes right out of human experience, because, humans have I think most of us have a kind of default model that thought-like stuff, it's our thoughts, they stay inside us. They don't go off into the world like a Jedi force and do stuff in the world. It's just like our thoughts.
Sure.
Um, all of us have experiences that contradict that. Like we have dreams, powerful dream. Everybody feels sometimes as if a dream came from outside, like it has information to follow your dream. So that's a different way of thinking about it. And all of us, even like really secular folks, when you are blisteringly angry and you curse something, it kind of feels like you're doing something, not like you're just saying, you're describing your emotion. It feels like you're acting. So there's something, we all have these contradictory intuitions about thoughts and how they work. So different social worlds build those up in different ways. And they always build them up I think about it as a within limits clause, like certain people, certain thoughts, certain words. And those are the ones that are powerful. But basically, in this big project, we asked people a whole set of questions about thoughts. And we gave them stories like, imagine that this woman has a neighbor and the neighbor's really angry at her. Could this neighbor hurt this woman? Supposing if she used special words, supposing if she was specially trained. What about now imagine somebody who's got a neighbor who really cares about her. She really, really cares about her. And supposing the neighbor just thinks about her in this intensely caring way, can that heal this other person? How would that work? Lots of different questions. And what we found was that there was this relationship between how many porous ideas people were willing to commit to and how many spiritual experiences they had.
Interesting.
The other thing that was true in all of these settings is that the more somebody said, and we asked them in a special way, the more somebody said that they liked getting caught up in their minds, like they liked this immersive orientation to the world. It's also true that the more experiences they reported, that there's something really important there about the attitude towards your mind or your cultural idea about your mind, something that really sort of matters there.
Do you think there's any, for some people, do you think their wiring prepares them more for this kind of experiences versus other? Like I think of, there's been a lot of study, in recent years about psychopaths and the famous psychopath tests and so on. And, the argument, at least of this one researcher, is that these people cannot experience empathy and so on. It's not in their wiring, right? So they learn to fake it. Most of them comply with society, but only as a game kind of. They don't really. So they're not wired for those things. Is it possible also with religious things that some people are more wired for that or less wired for that? I don't know if you could address that or not, but
sure. I think that's one of the deep questions.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are two things to say. I think that there is something like wiring or path. I use the term pathways,
right,
because wiring sort of implies that we really know what we're talking about.
Yeah, right.
So there's something like at least 4 pathways. One of them is this absorption pathway where people really enjoy getting caught up in their inner worlds. So kind of a pathway of the imagination. There's a pathway that probably has to do with sleep. I don't know enough about that, but it's clearly, a lot of those monks, those medieval Christian monks, they would wake them. They had played around with their sleep a lot, and that seemed to enable them to have powerful experiences of God. Madness is another pathway, psychosis, when people have there's something a little askew in the way in which they come to, or unusual about the way in which they draw inferences about the world and the way in which they perceive the world. All of these things, trance is another way. Maybe trance is like absorption, maybe it's different. When people go into trance states, those can get more powerful and deeper over time. And when people enter these trance states, and on the edge of these trance states, people can have powerful experiences of invisible others being present. There are all of these different kinds of pathways, and there are these different kinds of training. So all of these pathways are continua. I mean, it's not like, I'm pretty sure, it's not like there are, these special people and these people are nothing like them. There's some kind of distribution. And for all of these people, practices can push you up or down that continuum. And so yeah, I think that the wiring story is pretty important.
And in a sense, we're learning more all the time that we can adjust that quote wiring, right? Our brains are
Right.
fairly plastic, and our thinking actually can change us. I guess
Yes.
that's what I've come to hearing you say, is that as people think about these things differently and have a different framework and so on, they're kind of changing their brain
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And, one of the things I'm pretty impressed by is that we have a boatload of scientific data that suggests that religious practice on balance is good for you. I mean, I want to quickly say it's not clear that it's always good for society.
Right.
Lots of
Yeah.
religious ideas that have led to terrible, terrible wars.
Yeah.
Right.
But on balance, if you look at a group of people, and these people go to church, these people go to temple, these people have a good relationship with God, these other people don't, their bodies do better. I mean, jogging might even be more effective, but I mean, but jogging doesn't give you a relationship with God. I mean, but there's I mean, there are lots of things we do that improve our longevity, our immune system, our well-being, but religion is really one of them.
So now I get to the part that I think our audience is going to be particularly interested in and challenged by, which is your work with the evangelicals in particular. That's a little bit older. It's in the middle of those two sets of studies that we've just
Yeah.
talked about. But I wanted to have you put that work on the table so that we can now look at evangelicals in the same light. So maybe tell us a bit about your work with the evangelicals. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it began, you heard one of the people you talked to saying that you need to have coffee with Jesus.
Yeah, excellent. I was doing a project in San Diego with a colleague, and we were interviewing people of different kind of faith backgrounds. I met this blonde, beach blonde Californian girl, and she said that if I really wanted to understand her faith, I should have coffee with God. And I was just like, whoa. It was just like, I had not really thought about it that way. And I started paying attention in the church, and people were talking about God like a person. They were modeling this prayer practice, which was again like Ignatian practices, kind of on steroids, although they didn't talk about it that way. And they would say, and they would talk about dancing with Jesus and just cuddling with God. I mean, Jesus and God were kind of interchangeable. And almost like, and really kind of a lot like, God was a person among people. They weren't delusional. It became, the more I listened, the more I realized that going to church was kind of a way of reminding you to take this seriously. It wouldn't just happen. This sense of relationship with God. You had to practice, you had to think about it, you had to pray, you had to read books, you had to go to Bible study, you had to, hang out with your church community. But I was pretty impressed that a lot of people seem to do that. And so I began trying to describe the steps through which somebody would come into the church and learn how to do stuff so that they would have what they experienced as this intimate relationship with God and how that worked in a culture. So I moved to Chicago, and then eventually I moved to back to Northern California. And when I saw that I saw that there were a set of ideas people needed to take on board. They needed to learn a lot about God and the Bible, and I looked at the way they were doing that, and you would, and I saw a Bible study. People go every week to Bible study, and Bible study, if you pay attention, is really a way of correcting somebody else's understanding of God. So, no, everybody's talking about God. Nobody has a clue really about what somebody else means by God, because that was one of the things that sort of suddenly, I remember being so startled by realizing that I think they all have different experiences of God, and it means that word means different things to them. But what they can see is if somebody says something and they don't think. So in this particular church I was at, God was great. So this was, the God that really emerged in the 70s and 80s, and with these new evangelical churches, they really worried about people who were unchurched. So they present, this is not a hellfire and brimstone God. This is a great big teddy bear who loves you unconditionally, and you just need to get into the church, and you will feel loved. And so somebody would in the group would say that God was punishing them, and other people would say, no, I don't think that's what's happening. And they would read, the Bible. They'd read Judges, and they'd read some terrible story, and they would say, "Oh, that happened in the office today with me." And but you'd figure out how God was making things better for you. And so I looked at what people were how people were sort of modeling God. I looked at how people were being encouraged to sort of pretend that God was there, so that they were, it's just straight out of C.S. Lewis. You pretend that God is there, so he will be there for you. And, and so I looked at the way that people were sort of learning to just talk to God as if he's there, and just talk out loud, or talk in your mind, or maybe even lay a dinner plate for God. Put out a cup of coffee, and put out a beer for God. You've got your own beer, and it'll help you feel that he's there. And and there's this whole language in the church of God talking to people, and I could tell that it was sophisticated, right? So if you've got a church where God is talking personally to every single person in the church, people are pretty clear that many people are getting it wrong, right? And people would even say this. And I heard a pastor say, if God tells you to relax before the interview, totally fine. Just assume that that's God. If God tells you to quit your job and move to Los Angeles, I want you to be praying with your Bible study, your Bible study group, your prayer team, come pray with me, and it will discern whether you are interpreting God correctly. So there's a lot of sophistication about the stuff between, God and the person.
Right.
But there was the same thing and people would pray with in this imagination rich way. So I noticed they would talk about, they'd sit in Jesus' lap, they'd go for a walk with Jesus. There were books like Richard Foster's book teaches you how to do this. I actually did an Ignatian study exercise, a 9-month exercise with members of this evangelical community in California. And I was impressed that, just like with the magicians, people would say, you didn't get God unless you did these practices. It was pretty clear that some people were better than others, that people who practiced, they would change. And so some people would talk about there was a woman that was well known as a prayer warrior in the church.
Right.
And she was somebody who loved this immersive stuff. I mean, there's a scale that I use to measure absorption, and she was looking at the scale, and she was like, the guy who wrote this lived inside my mind. This is amazing. And there were other people who would look at that scale, and I remember one young man who looked at the scale and he said, there are people who say true to these items. And I knew that and this was somebody who was actually in my prayer circle, and he One time we actually prayed together for him because he said, "Oh, I want God to talk to me in a booming voice, and he doesn't talk to me." So I could tell that there was some kind of learning process, that some people would start, they didn't know what this meant, and then they would end up saying that, God talks to them. And they would had lots of individual moments in which they had some experience that felt like it wasn't, them. And they were sort of, and they began to get a sense that there was what a psychologist might call an object, a person who was there, who was interacting with them. And, I was impressed by the fact that they would often forget. People would talk about, forgetting that they'd meant to be like Jesus and they just weren't. They would, they would get mad at their coworkers. But there was a sense that there was this being that became real to them in a complicated way.
Did you find any significant gender difference?
Yeah, women on average were a little better at this than men.
Okay.
And women on average score a little bit more highly on the absorption scale.
Okay.
So you could give a sociological account for that. Women tend to secularize more slowly in every country. Or you could give this more psychological account of that. Maybe women do this more easily. You could say that, women are book group members, men tend not to be. There's something about these different cultural differences.
Right. Okay.
So there's a recurring theme, and this was intentional. I wanted to ask the questions in this way to see this theme coming out. It takes a lot of practice, takes a lot of time and repetition, that some people eventually learn to become better at it. Some people are better at it. And the cognitive rewiring, we talked a lot about that. And I thought, is this all about collecting a data set of experiences? You have to spend hours and hours, days, years, whether you're a Druid or whether you're a Christian, evangelical Christian, spending all this time collecting a large data set, an expanding data set of experiences. And so in my own life, for example, I spent about a decade in the Pentecostal charismatic world, and I learned that part of that seeking God experience involved long hours at the front of the church. And there was a physicality about this. There was a lot of hyperventilating, a lot of shaking, rocking back and forth, repeating phrases over and over. So it was physical, but it was also cognitive. And the training and the rewiring that you spoke about, I'm thinking in part you're developing that data set of experiences, but then you're also developing a cognitive strategy of developing a sense of expectancy. You have to believe fervently and overwhelmingly that God wants to interact with you. And so you have to look for those God moments in this developing data set. You keep on expanding that data set of possible encounters of God, and then you search that data set and you start to begin to connect the dots between them. And inevitably, the data set, when you log hours and hours of prayer meditation, that data set gets big enough that you begin to make those connections. Mm-hmm. And so I've used, as an analogy of what I'm getting at, the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. A guy who stands at a distance from a barn and he starts spraying bullets into the side of the barn. And then after firing off dozens of rounds, he then goes up and paints a bullseye around the densest concentration of bullet holes and claims to be a sniper. And so I'm wondering if that's an apt analogy of what I'm getting at here. Do you think this idea of prayer meditation is building a data set of potential hits, and the cognitive rewiring is strengthening a sense of expectancy and combining that with confirmation bias, and then applying both of those to the data set to identify potential hits as God encounters, or again, Druid encounters?
That's just one of the deep questions. So I can see the story then where people are building the sense of God, that God really becomes a person, and they're always going back to, and they're remembering these good encounters of God and the things that God predicted correctly in their life. And people are complicated. Some people have a lot of spiritual experiences and that brings them into a church. Some people work hard to build up the sense of God, and then they have spiritual experiences. There's a lot of variance of the story. But what this doesn't tell us is whether there is a God, mm-hmm. and whether this God looks like this. So, so the Druids and the evangelical Christians have a pretty different model of who God is. They're both using many of the same training practices.
Right.
Sometimes when evangelical Christians read my work, sometimes it makes them that they really like it because it says, oh, you have to work to do this stuff and not everybody is good at it. This helps to explain why some people don't do this stuff, to use the words of John Wimber, who founded the Vineyard Church. Sometimes when they read the work, it's like, oh my goodness, this is all, they're horrified because they say, well, this is just a set of practices and you can have a lot of false experiences. And it's, there's this famous comment by the great student of the Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, great scholar. And he once said that the true revolutionary is the mystic, because it's and he was, and the context here is that this is a deep worry of the church. People who have profound, intimate, personal experiences of God, they can say that they don't need the church anymore. And they can start their own church. They can just not go to church. They don't need any of this stuff. John Krakauer wrote this very disturbing book about a couple of Mormons who heard God tell them to kill their sister-in-law.
Yeah.
Which they did. I mean, this is at the heart of medieval Christianity as well. Who is crazy? Who is lying? Who had a genuine experience of God? So that's where the social world is so important for people. And again, people answer this question in different ways.
Yeah.
Different social worlds answer this question in different ways.
It's interesting as you're talking there. One of the great, kind of clarion calls of the Reformation was Luther's idea of the priesthood of all believers, right? That no longer did your experience of God have to be mediated by the institution of the church, which of course was a tremendous threat to the institution. And it's interesting that, the Protestant evangelical tradition, that's one of the streams that runs into it. Mm-hmm. And so it makes sense to me that the idea of this personal, unmediated, direct relationship with God is a very Protestant. I'm not saying it doesn't occur in Catholicism, but it's very, very widespread in Protestantism, especially conservative Protestantism. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why, Weber talked about this, oscillations between charisma and routine, because, charismatic stuff just gets too dangerous. There's a great version of that story in Anaheim with Calvary Chapel, where Chuck Smith was the Pentecostal pastor who sort of invited a hippie Christian called Lonnie Frisbee into his church.
Yeah.
And, there are all these hippie Christians, and Lonnie and Chuck are really using intense charismatic experience to bring these kids in, and they kind of give up LSD for speaking in tongues.
Yeah.
And at some point, Chuck Smith says, that they're here for the experience. They're not here for God. I'm going to move us away from this charismatic stuff. And he wrote a book called Charismania. But it's, this is always the cycle.
Yeah.
In general, you can say something about people who are psychotic and people who are not psychotic and how their experience looks different. But it's really hard to, I can't pass judgment on whether this God is better than that God. But many people in different churches, will do that.
So, Tanya, I guess one question that's related to this, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I'm just curious. I'm looking now at the psychological benefits, the evolutionary advantages of this. We've been talking about developing this worldview of talking with God, experiencing God. Is this part of a coping mechanism, a developing worldview that might give you a sense of control over a world that just scares us?
I think there are actually many ways to tell this story. So one way to tell the story is that humans likely have evolved a part of the packet of cognitive evolution is that we see agency everywhere.
Right.
And so some people, Justin Barrett will talk about this as the hyperactive attention detection device. And so there, we see faces on cars and faces in clouds. And so there's something to that. And I'm sure that's correct. And what that doesn't explain was how people maintain this sense that there is an agent present. That's why you have to do all the work. It's pretty clear, I think, that for some people, if they get God right, that God becomes like a social relationship, and that diminishes loneliness. And I think that's clearly an advantage for people.
Oh, we're such social animals.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
God really does. A friend of mine, Uwe Choate, has demonstrated that God actually kind of behaves like a social relationship when you put somebody into a fMRI machine and scan them. Their brain looks like they are talking to God casually is like talking to a social relationship. And yeah, I think that's it. It's a powerful self-soothing device. I mean, if you think God is, actually, lots of folks said this to me, God is kind of like a great big comfy therapist.
Right.
Downside of God as a therapist is that he doesn't surprise you. The upside is that, he's always there.
Right. Okay, we're getting long. Scott, you had a question about Tanya's earlier book, something about the last chapter?
Well, yeah, it's kind of a question, I guess, maybe a comment too. First of all, love the book overall, but I particularly enjoyed the last chapter. It described my own journey in many respects.
Mm-hmm.
I was a child of the Jesus movement, so I was very much involved in that at one time, and I felt the history you give there of evangelicalism and the development of fundamentalism to the new evangelicals, so on, was nuanced. And so often I read these kinds of accounts, and they're just, they conflate things. I mean, even evangelical and fundamentalists are constantly conflated, and they really are different things. It's, I guess it's a spectrum. So I just would highly recommend our audience to read the book. But if you have a hard time getting through if it's too long or something, at least read the last chapter, because I think it would give you a very good grounding in that respect. But what I really appreciated about the book overall is it struck me as pretty non-reductionist. There, in my experience, when I've read various books on the psychology of religion and things like that, there is a tendency to be very reductionist. Well, it's nothing but this, it's nothing but that, and really we should just kind of write it off, and I appreciate that you take it seriously, which as a scientist is interesting to me, because you are a scientist, but you're a scientist who, to use that word, immersed. You immerse yourself in these experiences, which is how do your colleagues? What are they? Because like as an anthropologist, you have this vision of the anthropologist as the white-coated, objective, walking into some primitive culture as a pure observer. And that is not the approach you've taken here.
Yeah, I think that compared to some colleagues, I get a little more immersed in the worlds I'm studying than other colleagues.
Okay.
And I just find the texture of human experience to be utterly fascinating. So, it's just people are so amazingly complicated and mysterious.
Right.
Why, people just, and you can understand a little bit here and a little bit there.
Right.
And so I do find myself kind of just fascinated by the experience, and then wanting to know as much as I can about the texture of somebody's experience, and then being pretty alert to the fact that there's so much I don't know.
Right.
Sure. There's been a lot of talk lately about what is it, psilocybin or I don't know.
Psilocybin.
Psilocybin.
Yeah.
And of course, there's been a lot of discussion of this. It's fascinating. What about that? Can people almost self-induce a psilocybin, whatever, to kind of experience? Is there an analogy between those two things?
So it's a great question. I myself have not walked down that road. I know some people have invited me to do that, and it's not me. And so it's, and some people, I have to say, the people who use ayahuasca, much more proselytizing than evangelicals, in my experience.
Wow.
It's like the pressure I feel from ayahuasca folks is kind of amazing.
Because they've had this experience. They want you to share this experience, probably, right?
They love the experience.
Yeah.
And so there are similar dimensions. It's the social framing of the experience is super important. A friend of mine, David Dupuy, talks about this. He works with ayahuasca takers, and it changes people's expectations. And so some people want to say, Luke, the way that you have said, that it's something like ayahuasca quickly changes those neural connections. What you see is that people actually are taking ayahuasca a bunch of times in order to get that feeling. So it's very helpful for some people. I worry a little bit about it, but that's my crusty, uptight, anxious self.
Okay, I echo Scott's high recommendation for Dr. Lerman's book, When God Talks Back, Understanding the American Evangelical Relationship with God. And that's a bit of an older book. Now there's this more recent book, How God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others. I highly recommend both books. Tanya, are there any more books on the horizon?
Yes, I'm writing one now on voices and on the relationship between madness and spiritual experience.
Excellent.
Oh, wow. That should be really good.
We will call you again about that.
Yeah.
I love that. Really great interview. Very thoughtful questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for giving us your time, Tanya.
Okay.
Take care, Luke and Scott. Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye-bye. You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.